Good evening, everybody. My name is Ian Hesketh, and I'm Chair of Chester Heritage Festival. Firstly, I'd just like to welcome you all to Chester Heritage Festival 2021, and to what I'm sure will be a very enlightening and entertaining presentation about the Chester workhouses, told through the experiences and facts attached to real people and the lives they lived. Hopefully, some of you will already have had the opportunity to engage with the Chester Heritage Festival since its launch early on Friday morning of last week, and also had the opportunity to browse the festival website, which is new for this year with its blend of virtual and face-to-face content and events. If not, please have a look at www.chesterheritagefestival.co.uk to see what else is coming over the course of the following week. So before I introduce our speaker for this evening, I'd just like to take care of a few housekeeping matters. So could I please firstly just ask that everybody remains muted and with cameras turned off during the course of the presentation, just to reduce the possibility of any technical issues occurring. Secondly, once this evening's presentation is finished, we'll be running a Q&A session so that everyone can seek further information or any clarification on anything that arises from the talk. So everyone's welcome to join this. We'll run the chat throughout the presentation. So if you want to pose any questions through the chat, please do so. And alternatively, once we reach the Q&A session, if anyone would like to ask any questions directly, please use the raised hand function so that we can come to people in turn. And also just to advise that we are recording this session. We intend to reuse this on the website, on the Chester Heritage Festival website in future. So just to advise people that it is being recorded. So without further ado, it's now for me to welcome and to introduce our speaker for this evening's presentation, Chester Workhouses, the Lives of Others, and that's Nick Kevern. So Nick is the editor of Inside History, a Chester-based publication. Inside History is a thematic history magazine that has produced issues on medicine, crime, and protest, to name but a few. Prior to establishing Inside History magazine, Nick was a history teacher. Since leaving the profession, Nick has gone on to become a sports journalist, focusing mainly on golf, where he's covered major championships, including the Open and the Ricoh Women's British Open. In founding Inside History, Nick has reconnected with his love of history once again. This talk for the Chester Heritage Festival is part of the magazine's commitment to local history. A special booklet about this talk has also been produced and is available to be downloaded. Further details will be on the final slide of this evening's presentation. And there are also plans to produce a special edition based on the city of Chester and its remarkable history. So if I can now hand over to Nick to lead us through this fascinating insight into the world of the workhouse as it really was in Chester.
Thank you very much, Ian. Can everyone hear me, first of all? Can we all hear everything?
I can hear you, Nick.
Good. Good. Two people, that's always good.
The rest, Nick, are muted, hopefully, as I requested.
Right, okay, that's fantastic. So, yeah, welcome to this talk about the Chester Workhouse, which, as you can see on this opening picture, was just down by, the original one was just down by the Roodee racecourse. But the key thing about this talk today is how I'm hoping to show you how the workhouse really worked, but mainly through the eyes and through the documents of people who actually were there. Oh, hang on, what's that now? So here's a little list of the people who we're going to be looking at. And I've tried my best to really vary how the different kinds of people who we would have seen in the workhouse. So we're going to start off just by going through some of these names, and these names are going to keep reoccurring throughout the whole talk. So we've got, first of all, we've got William Aldis, who was the master of the house during the late Victorian period. The whole talk only really focuses on that, the Victorian period. And William Eldis was the man in charge, the master of the house. Next up, we have Jane and Emma Worrell, who were a mother and daughter who came to the workhouse. And we're going to be looking more about also how does this affect women in the workhouse, but also women with younger children. I'm also going to be looking at a gentleman called John Tong, who acted as the night wardsman in the infirmary of the workhouse. There's also Captain Philip Salisbury, who was actually the son of a local Chester MP. And we're going to be looking at why does someone like him have to come to a workhouse? And then finally, there's Daniel Allmark, who was an elderly resident. And we're going to be looking at how someone can go through the vast majority of their life without ever needing the workhouse or any form of poor relief. And then all of a sudden needing it. We're going to look at how he goes about that. So this talk is going to focus on the workhouse through the records of these 5 individuals. There will be other people mentioned as well throughout the course of this talk, but I've specifically chosen these 5 because they give us such a wider spectrum of what life in the workhouse actually was. So in front of you now on the presentation, we've got 2 pictures of the workhouse. Now, the one on the left comes from one of these old Victorian pictorial maps of Chester. And it's right by the Roodee racecourse, as you can see. And then the one on the right is when the workhouse finally, it gets moved from the Roodee over to Hoole. And this is what's left of it. And it gets converted into a jam, marmalade and confectionery factory by R.J. Davis and Company. But it gives us a much clearer idea compared to the other picture about how the workhouse would have actually looked at the time. And you can see we've got a massive square in the middle, and this would have been where people would have done some of their work. And we can see that it's about 2 stories high. But it just gives us an idea as well, that the picture on the right, just how vast this place actually was. So the Chester Workhouse, this particular one by the Roodee racecourse, was built and started welcoming people finally back in 1759. And this was, or does become, Chester's central workhouse. And actually this workhouse, compared to some of the others in the country, was actually quite forward thinking. Previously, the way poor relief was actually distributed throughout the city of Chester was through a parish system. So each individual parish in Chester was responsible for their own poor. And Chester decided that we want to do something a little bit different. So in building this workhouse, which was called the House of Industry, now we can centralize our poor relief. And we can keep it all under one roof. That way we can keep the administration a lot more fluid, but also we now know exactly who our poor residents are. And this is really, really revolutionary, because it's only until 1834, when the new poor law gets introduced, that this system actually gets nationalized across the whole country. So in that respect, it's really, really quite forward thinking. Now, this workhouse down by Paradise Row actually witnesses this massive juxtaposition of the whole industrial revolution during the Victorian period. I'm sure people who've been to the area know it quite well. And we all know the railway viaduct, which was actually built by the son of George Stephenson, who was known as the father of the railways. But prior to that being built in the 1840s, the workhouse would have been quite visible to absolutely everyone who would have seen it. And it's only when this gets built that it gets slightly obscured. But this juxtaposition of the Industrial Revolution, on one hand, we've got this railway viaduct being built. On the other hand, on the other side, we've got the workhouse. And then on the other side of that, we've got the race course. And it's all going on in a very, very small area of Chester. So for those who don't know what the workhouse actually was, the workhouse was the Victorian equivalent to our modern day welfare system. And this system back then, and even through our eyes now, is often seen as quite synonymous with cruelty and shame, where poverty was actually seen as a crime. And this goes with a lot of what Victorian values actually were at the time. They believed that you've got to work yourself out of poverty. They believed in very Christian values. And what would happen is you would go to the workhouse and you would exchange your labor, which could be a vast variety of things. It could go from stone breaking, oakum picking, but they were all very tedious and soul destroying jobs. But in doing those jobs, you would actually get some form of relief. And that relief would come in a place to sleep and something to eat. And it really was as simple as that. Now, for those who were sick, who needed medical assistance, there was an infirmary in the workhouse. We're going to be talking a bit more about that later. But it was very rudimentary. It was very, very basic medical care. If something serious did happen, the master of the house would call on a doctor to come and see you. But other than that, it was quite rudimentary. Now, when families entered this workhouse, they'd be segregated from each other. Each of the sides you see would also act as a different area for them to sleep. So you would have women on one side, men on the other, and children as well. And they'd all be segregated the second you come in. And the workhouse was also very regimented as well. You'd eat your dinners in rows. You'd eat them in silence. A prayer would be said before you eat your dinner. So what did you have to do in order to come in here? Well, you basically had to prove that you were completely destitute, that you had nothing, no money, and also no real prospects. And for the casual poor who depended quite heavily on daily work, which I suppose is like what we'd call our modern day gig economy, trips to this workhouse would be actually quite frequent. But it might look like a prison from the outside and even in the way it's constructed. But actually the poor who stayed there were free to leave at any time. All they had to do was give a few hours notice, have their final meal, and then they will be exchanged their uniform, which they wore in the workhouse, for the clothes that they came in, and then they'd be sent on their way. And this was all in this Victorian idea that you could possibly rebuild your life and start over again. But as we're going to see, some people just simply couldn't do that. The imposing nature of this building as well scared many people. Rumors start circulating just how terrible the workhouse actually was. And actually, it doesn't give us a very clearer picture about how the situation really was in Chester, because there are a lot of people would have actually preferred to have taken their chance on the streets rather than actually gone in there. But it does act as a constant reminder to these people that you're never far away from any hard times, and the fear that actually comes with that. Now, this would be a system that would be in place nationally until about 1948 with the birth of the NHS. And actually, a lot of these old workhouses become the new hospitals. Chester's, once it moves from the Roodee over to Hoole, becomes hospital in the 1930s. So once again, it's another forward-thinking idea and institution. Now, the workhouse in Chester by the Roodee was called the House of Industry, and despite its grand sounding name, everyone really knew what it really was. It had a simple but very effective Georgian design, and that was designed to send a message. And that is that being on the breadline outside the workhouse was actually better than trying to be in it. Most would do everything in their power to try and avoid the place, but for some, this becomes a necessary evil. And what we actually see in the late Georgian period and the early Victorian period is that Chester is completely changing in terms of its economy. What we start seeing is the traditional economies of Chester start floundering. We used to build ships. We used to build textiles. We used to make pottery. And a lot of these things, as the Industrial Revolution starts gaining momentum, simply move away. A lot of the ships during the Napoleonic War, some of them were even built here in Chester. And they go to places like Liverpool, they go to Stoke-on-Trent for the potteries, they go to Manchester for the textiles. And for the casual poor, this is absolutely the one thing they don't want, because a lot of them would have actually got working on the ships or working in the textiles industries simply by turning up. Do you need any work? I'm here to work for you. With those now going, things change for the poor, and what we actually start seeing is a lot more people going to the workhouse. But Chester's floundering traditional economies, despite that, something new was growing, and that was Chester becoming very much a retail and hospitality place for day trippers and holiday makers. And this is mainly due to the improvements in public transport to the city with the railway, and Thomas Brassey, Claire's going to be doing a talk on him, and more improved roads as well. And all of this means that more people are coming, and they need somewhere to stay, and they need somewhere to eat and to drink and to shop. And I'm going to introduce you to the very first person, because the person who eventually becomes master of the house is a man called William Aldis. And he is one of those people who actually moves to Chester in order to make a name for himself. So on one hand, we got some really bad unemployment going on in Chester, particularly for the casual labourers. But then we're bringing in people like William Aldis, who actually see this new retail boom as an opportunity. So what you got in front of you here is William's marriage certificate. And he marries Elizabeth Salisbury. And he is originally from, well, he's not originally from Preston, but he did move there. He was actually born in Halesworth in Suffolk. And his family moved up to Preston. And from there, he becomes an apprentice for the new hatter trade. And he's pretty good at it. So they get married. As you can see, they're 24 and 25 years old. They get married on February the 12th. And one of the first things that they do as this new couple is they decide that they want to really make a go of things for themselves. So they actually move down to Chester only a few months later, and they're going to start off their brand new business. And their new business is going to be a brand new shop on Bridge Street, a clothing and hattier shop. Needless to say, business is going really, really well for them by the time they move down. More shops, more day trippers are a massive boost to his business. Chester really does become a retailer's dream. And we can see here in the 1851 census, which is, he's been in Chester now for about 10 years. And we can see just how successful it's actually becoming. If you can see my cursor, we can see William Aldis is the head of the family. And he's got his occupation down as general outfitter. But we can also see the growth of his family. We've got Elizabeth Salisbury, Elizabeth Aldis, his wife. We have another daughter, Elizabeth Aldis, who is also going to be mentioned again later. But we also see down near the bottom that he's actually hiring people as well. So this individual here, John Eaton, is his nephew, all the way from Preston. And he's confident enough in the early start of his business to actually hire him, to actually use him as an apprentice and pass over some of those key skills that he's also got. So the ability to employ and have his own premises and start working with apprentices actually shows us that William Aldis at this particular point in his life is doing very, very well for himself. But retail is a very volatile business, and the Aldises soon find themselves in trouble. When they first arrived in Chester, everything was still quite fresh in the retail industry. Things were still growing. By the time we get to a little bit later, all of a sudden he's got intense competition. In fact, there were 18 hatters in the city alone. And obviously he gets into some key issues, because by the time we get to the 11th of December, 1857, he decides that he is actually going to close his business. But whilst the times were good, as you can see here, he's actually putting out advertising in the local newspaper to actually really highlight some of the wonderful things that he's actually got. But as I said, business closes on the 11th of December, 1857. But we can see here on this one here, things have changed for him by 1871. Now he's the master of the house, right down by the Roodee. And as I said before, the Roodee area itself provides a real diverse spectrum of the Victorian period as a whole. You know, on one side, we've got this ever-growing racecourse. And as the stands grow larger, so too do the number of punters. And they would have been wearing things which William Aldis probably might have sold them prior. And they've got money to burn, and they're gambling on the horse races. However, just a little stone throw away, William Aldis is now going to start taking over as the master of the house of industry. So it's quite interesting. On one hand, we've got Chester's wealthy gambling their money aside, and then on the other hand, those who are desperate enough to actually use a workhouse just to survive. So as master of the house now, William Aldis will be a million miles away from the world of a hatter. He did have some expertise in terms of growing something from the ground up. But now he was actually responsible to other people. He was responsible to people who were called the Border Guardians. And the Border Guardians were in charge of everything about the workhouse. It was only really William Aldis's job to oversee what they really want, and the day-to-day administration and the roll call and the admissions. He would be responsible for sending for medical officers, the upkeep of the house, the safety of everyone in care, and also the supervision of all the preparation of food. But the board of guardians, each one of them would have come from a different part of Chester. So each one would have represented the old parish system that we spoke about earlier. And there'd be a representative from each parish. So we also see on this census that Elizabeth also joins in, as does their daughter, Elizabeth Sarah, as well. And this used to often be the case, where the master of the house would often work alongside his wife, which is really, really quite beneficial, as we've got men and women in the workhouse, and as they are segregated as well. And the daughter, Elizabeth Sarah, is actually going to eventually become the school mistress herself a little bit later on. So the key parts of the family really working together in order to try and make it work. Now, by all accounts, from what I've researched, the Aldises really did perform their duties with the utmost care. And it's only in 1873, 2 years after this census, that Elizabeth Sarah Elders, the daughter, actually does become the school mistress. But he also had something else that he had to do. This is while it's still at the Roodee. However, the situation is starting to get a little bit out of hand in terms of how many people are needing poor relief. So what the Board of Governors decide is that they're going to actually move to the other side of town. They're going to move to Hoole and therefore close down this workhouse. So William Aldis would have also had to have overseen all of that as well, in making sure that everyone gets over and there's no one left behind. However, this would actually be a move that he'd have to do by himself. Well, not by himself, but with his daughter. Because when the Hoole workhouse gets completed in 1878, just a year before that, his wife Elizabeth passes away. And William would stay in this position for the rest of his life as the master of the house until his own death in 1884. And this is his grave. And he's actually buried alongside his wife Elizabeth. And this was taken in Overley Cemetery. And his obituary is pretty big news. All the newspapers cover it. And they really did highlight how he did this job right up until his death. In fact, they described him as, and I'm quoting now, very generally respected as a kind, conscientious officer of the Union, and was held in much esteem, not only by the large circle of friends and acquaintances throughout the city and district, but by the whole body of inmates of the institution under his care. I'm now going to move on to Jane and Emma Worrell. And I first stumbled upon Jane and her name when quite early on into the research for this. But what you see in front of you right now is a gatepost and a church. And that is all that survives of any buildings in the city of Chester based on the workhouse. There are some others in places like Tarvin and places like that, but this talk is only focusing on the city of the key city of Chester. This is all that's left. And when I first saw this, I always thought to myself, I wonder how many people and how many stories that gatepost actually has to tell of desperate people who needed the assistance of the workhouse. But they wouldn't have just welcomed paupers. They would have welcomed people who were seriously ill. They would have welcomed the elderly. And they also would have welcomed the official observers. Now, Jane would have left the old workhouse at the Roodee and made the journey over here. She was actually one of those individuals who stayed at both. But she doesn't come with her daughter. And the reason why Jane's story becomes quite emotional, really, is mainly because of what you see in front of you here. Now, what you have here is a list, and the list would have been for the whole county, and the list, this is only part of the list for Chester. But this is the people who actually depended on the workhouse. The workhouse was designed that you would be in there maybe for a few days, maybe a few weeks, few months, and then you would leave and try and rebuild your life. And then if you need more assistance, you'll come back. But in 1861, it became a new law where every single workhouse had to highlight what they called their long-term inmates. And Jane's is there right at the bottom, just above Congleton. And as we can see here, and this is the one from 1861, she's been there for 10 years. And the reason for her being there for so long, it's suggested right at the bottom, weak mind. But as you can see from the other names on this list as well, there are people who've been there longer. So Joseph Thomas, who's also of weak mind, has been there for 50 years. There's also others as well, though. Just trying to find my part. There are others as well. Harry Dale, who's not on that list, but on the other page. He was at the workhouse for 6 years, and he was described as subject to fits, epilepsy. So he would have been very heavily dependent on the infirmary, but also the fact that there'd be people around him who could actually help him when he does have a fit. There was also Elizabeth Bartlam, who was also a long-term inmate. And she was a widow with young children. Her young children come with her to the workhouse. And because their children are so young, she knew that there'd be a chance actually that her children might actually end up with a better life than what they would on the streets. One of the key reasons for that is because also in the House of Industry over at the Roodee and even at the Union Workhouse in Hoole, there was a school, and the school would assist them on their education, but it would also help them in case someone comes along looking for apprentices so they can have a better life. Now, Jane's very hard to track outside of the workhouse. What we do know about her is that she is the daughter of Samuel Worrell and Emma Connock, who were married on the 8th of April, 1881. And Jane would arrive not long after. Officially, she was baptized in March 1812. Trying to find anything out about Jane before her time at the workhouse was really, really hard. In fact, the only thing we actually found was Emma, who was baptized at St. Oswald's on the 28th of March, 1842. And all we have on her certificate, which this is actually a census which you're seeing in front of you now, but the only name that we have on Emma's birth certificate is Jane's. And that suggests that Emma's unmarried with a bastard child. And all these things are the ingredients for very difficult times in Victorian Britain, and Jane would have had to struggle to have raised Emma by herself. So what you see in front of you now is the census of 1851, all of which would have been compiled by the master of the house. And we see both Emma and Jane, if you can see the cursor just here, Jane and Emma. And Jane would have entered the workhouse at the age of 39, and her daughter was 11 years old. Now, we know that Jane couldn't have been there much longer before that because she appears on the long-term inmate list of 1861, which stated that she was there for 10 years. So they might have only just arrived. And as Jane and Emma approached this rather imposing building, they would have had this distinct smell in this area. The new gasworks were in the area, which was going to cause significant air pollution, and that would be coupled with the smell of burning coal from the chimneys of the workhouse itself. And the fog and smoke was actually something that raised quite a number of concerns. In 1858, Dr. Bedford raised this issue with the Board of Guardians, highlighting that the health concerns of being right next to the gasworks was absolutely disastrous for the workhouse inmates. But Emma and Jane had obviously run out of options by this point, and this becomes their new home. And as they entered the workhouse, they would have been stripped of their clothes, they would have been bathed, they would have received a very basic medical examination and issued with a new uniform. Their original clothes would be taken away and washed and disinfected. And their new uniform was often a shapeless, wasteless blue and white striped frock. And they would also be separated from each other. So from this point on, Jane would sleep and work in the women's ward, and Emma would go off with the rest of the children. So with Emma only being 11 years of age, she would actually receive education. And this kind of education was 3 hours a day, and it would be reading, writing, and arithmetic. Then they would go off and learn new skills for trades that could possibly be used for apprenticeships. The chances are, though, that this is more education than she's ever received in her life. Occasionally, though, she would still be allowed to see her mother, as there was often a daily interview where the mothers and the fathers could actually meet their children to see how they're getting on. And once that meeting's taken over, Jane would leave her daughter would go back to the children's ward, and then Jane would just continue to work. So Jane's day would be spent rising at 6 a.m. with breakfast at 6:30. And then work would begin at 7 o'clock in the morning. And with the exception of dinner, supper, her occasional daily interview with Emma, and sleeping, her day would consist of domestic tasks such as cooking, cleaning, washing the workhouse laundry. It was the men who actually performed all the manual tasks in the workhouse. Now, what we do know based on the records is that Emma would have experienced cramped conditions in her dormitory, and sick children often slept alongside the healthy children. And this is far from safe in a very small area. And it was actually only following a smallpox epidemic in 1841 that the House of Industry actually decided that perhaps it might be a good idea to actually include an infirmary. And it was completed in 1842. And what the Board of Guardians actually did is that basically they decided to convert the former lunatic wing, which was designed to keep them away from others. They converted that into the infirmary, and now all of a sudden, they're now in the workhouse with everyone else. Now, this mixture of air pollution from the gas works and the cramped conditions in the children's dorm and the risk of serious spread and infection was actually noted by the poor law inspectors, who said that the House of Industry provided, and I'm quoting here, inadequate care. And this level of care might have something to do with a record that I found relating to a Emma Worrell in Chester, which indicated that she died in 1851, the same year she arrived into the workhouse. Now, all I have is her name and that her death occurred in the last quarter of the year, and there's no age indicated on the records. And I've tried to dig a little bit deeper, but unfortunately, I've not had much luck. But given the lack of information that we actually got from the House of Industry, and the fact that this could actually been a workhouse burial in a pauper grave, we can make an assumption that this could be Jane's daughter, because we don't see her again. However, there is also, and I really do hope that this is the one, there's a chance that she may have actually been indentured as an apprentice and went away somewhere else. But either way, Emma's short time at the House of Industry, with her now gone, Jane's left completely alone. So she's unmarried, she's lost her daughter, and she's got no hope left. And Jane slowly over time gets reclassified as an inmate, first of all, but then slowly over time, she gets reclassified from pauper to weak-minded, and there's no more mentions of Emma. The workhouse now is Jane's official home, and her mind slowly drifts away. And she would spend the next 34 years in the workhouse and witness the move from the Roodee over to the new Union Workhouse in Hoole. And we can see here on the screen that she was 70 years old by the time another census arrives. But there's a bit of hope for Jane. To survive this long in the Victorian era in a workhouse is pretty good. And that can kind of tell us that actually the workhouse changes over time. It actually does become a place where someone like Jane can actually stay a lot longer than the short amount of time that she was intended to. But when she moves over to Hoole, she also is able to get buried properly. And by that, I mean that she was able to get buried by that church that we saw earlier with the gateposts, because all of that around her was consecrated ground at St. James's. And if you ever do go there, you'll notice that there's no headstones whatsoever. And that's because it's a pauper's grave, where Reverend Frederick Anderson conducted his services, and he would do a lot of them. And there are hundreds and hundreds of bodies in this very small area. And Jane is under there as well. When she died at the age of 73 years old on the 26th of September, when she gets buried. And she spent nearly half of her life in the workhouse. And it's going to sound horrible now, but Jane's actually one of the lucky ones. There was a consecrated ground, there was a church, so she was able to get buried there. In certain other areas of the country, places like London, Manchester, where there's a massive medical community, some people from the workhouses wouldn't have been buried at all. Instead, they would have been used as cadavers for medical experiments, for anatomical drawings. And this was exactly the same treatment that the Victorians gave to criminals. But thankfully for us in Chester, Jane is able to be buried properly. I'm going to move on now to John Tong, who was the night wardsman. And as you can see on the screen here, manslaughter at a workhouse. John Tong, this one's just an interesting story anyway. What we have a gentleman called Thomas Darlington, who was 84 years old when he died in the workhouse in 1894. But unlike Jane, his death actually hits the national newspapers. He was confined to the infirmary in the Hull Union Workhouse, and Darlington appeared to be in stable health. And that was until one fateful night when John Tong snapped. Tong entered the workhouse on the 31st of August, 1886. And during his stay, he would find himself acting as an infirmary orderly or a night wardsman. It would be his job to make sure that the sick were looked after overnight alongside the night nurse, who was a lady called Margaret Rogers. Margaret Rogers left Tong just briefly when the incident actually happened. The Chester Union Workhouse had only one night nurse, and she would be responsible for the health of all sick inmates, male and female. She would be assisted by a few wardsmen and women who would keep their eye on their patients. Those who looked after these people in the wards, the wardsmen and women, would have been normal, regular inmates who just so happened to have volunteered for the position. In return, they would get some extra food rations, and John Tong was one of these guys. Now, reports suggest that Darlington had a particularly bad night and that Tong actually brought him some water to try and help him out. But then a violent altercation takes place. Maybe something was said which agitated Tong, who then proceeds to pull Darlington from his bed. Tong strikes the elderly man in the chest so hard that he actually breaks 2 of his left ribs. And it would be these 2 fatal blows that would actually kill Thomas Darlington. Dr. Archer, who was the medical officer for the workhouse, was called frequently in order to provide medical assistance. And he testified in the inquest that Thomas Darlington had been in the care of the workhouse for about 2 years, and that he suffered from nothing more than senile decay. Examining the deceased, he found these 2 broken ribs that had penetrated the lungs, causing laboured breathing. A few days after the assault, Thomas Darlington unfortunately passes away. The master of the house at the time, a man called Mr. Turner, actually went to the inquest and acted as a witness. And he said that Tong had been working in the infirmary for about 6 years, but he had received complaints about Tong before. The complaint was that he was abusing the sick. So Tong had previous form, and Turner warned him about his handling of the sick on a few occasions. We don't know if one of these complaints was from Thomas Darlington himself. But in many respects, Turner's hands are pretty tied when it comes to handling Tong. Most workhouses had some medical staff at hand, but the use of wardsmen and women were largely jobs done by the inmates of the workhouse. Limited budgets essentially meant that this was a question of needs must. And whilst Turner may have wanted to have dismissed Tong with these rising accusations of ill treatment, there wouldn't have been too many people eager to take this position on. I've moved on one forward, but I'm still talking about Mr. Tong. Now, Tong would deny these murder charges, and he would basically say that it was an accident where he fell upon Darlington. But witnesses came forward saying that Tong had had previous altercations with Darlington, and one witness even recalled Tong throwing this elderly man onto the floor with force. The jury would come back with a verdict of manslaughter, and Tong would be punished to 12 months of hard labour. But the judge also recommended something else, and that was that the union should employ a second night nurse in order to ensure that these incidents should never happen again. Now, if you go off and download the free booklet at the end, you can actually see the court register of John Tong and his conviction. But I'm going to move on now to Captain Philip Salisbury. And I can imagine that as Captain Philip Salisbury stood before the Board of Governors, he would have had some rather bemused-looking people looking back at him. And that's because this is no usual application to enter the workhouse when he did so in 1900. Captain Salisbury was no ordinary applicant. He was the son of a former MP for the city, Enoch Salisbury. He was also a decorated soldier and successful author. It's not every day that some kind of minor celebrity is standing before the board seeking the help of the union, but here he is making his application to stay. Salisbury had a remarkable military career, and at the age of 44, he was able-bodied, but above all, he was a gentleman. He had, however, hit difficulties. When he was writing his current book at the time, he'd run out of money following a stay at a hotel, and with nowhere else to go, the workhouse seemed like a good option. He aimed to complete his book whilst staying at the workhouse, and whilst this is a bizarre request, the board accepted on the condition that this was only temporary during the harsh winter months. And Captain Salisbury would not go through the exact same measures that the other inmates received. The hard labour that many other able-bodied paupers endured would actually escape Salisbury, as he was allowed to continue to write his book. But this was not a hotel. He would still have to eat with the others in the same regimented fashion that the workhouse demanded. He would wear the same uniform and clothing as the others as well. The only difference is that he was here to finish a book. And that might seem really weird, but actually there's some kind of logic to it. He is a destitute writer, but he could get himself sorted once this book is finalized and published. So therefore, this book is actually a source of potential income. And the workhouse was only really designed as a temporary measure, mainly where paupers could eventually resume their lives once they had left. So in this respect, the union is actually fulfilling its duties. Yet, I must admit, it would be interesting to know what the other inmates would have thought about this preferential treatment. But Salisbury, if he thought that his time at the Chester Union Workhouse would be a private matter, then he's sorely mistaken, as you can see here from the newspapers. And he's described as a man who's down on his luck, and the papers really seem to empathise with him. They see him as a gentleman, a soldier, and a writer. But Salisbury doesn't stay there too long. It'll be short, just as he promised. Whilst his time at the workhouse would have caused a media sensation, so too does his departure. As we can see here, Captain Salisbury's married. A few weeks into his stay at the workhouse, he receives a strange visitor, and she's described in the Chester Observer as, quote, a stylishly attired lady. A cab comes to pick up Salisbury from the workhouse in Hoole a few days later, and inside the cab is the same lady waiting for Philip to emerge. Her name was Emily Cunningham, and from the workhouse the pair went off to the registry office and got married. There were people who in the newspapers who said that Emily Cunningham was actually a very wealthy lady as well. Now, Salisbury's story might actually have a happy ending, but it does remind us all that the workhouse was there for everyone, no matter their upbringing, no matter their social status, and that anyone can find themselves in troubled times, including the sons of former MPs. I'm going to move on now to our final individual, a man named Daniel Allmark. And he was a frequent visitor to the Chester Union Workhouse in Hoole from 1877. Yet his life prior to his time at the workhouse appears to have been relatively stable. He was a printer by trade, and he lived on Northgate Street with his wife, Mary Ann, and the couple had 7 children in total. However, Daniel's dependence on the union grew following the death of his wife in 1874. Daniel clearly tried to cope as best as he could for a few years, but his growing addiction to alcohol following his wife's death was beginning to take its toll. And by all accounts, he was a bit of a handful for the local authorities. The police were called on a number of occasions. According to the entry and release records that you see right in front of you now, also known as the Religious Creed Register, Daniel first entered the workhouse in July 1877, but he would leave in April 1878, with the reason being taken by the police drunk. It's just here. Once again, this is in the booklet if you want to see it much clearer. His issues with alcohol continue despite this. In August 1882, after coming back to the workhouse, he finds himself again in problems, and this time his reason for leaving the workhouse just simply states to prison. And the local newspapers tell us exactly what happened. Daniel, by this point, was 70 years old, and he found himself in the dock as the head of the house, William Oldys, is actually testifying against him. And this is something that William Oldys would actually spend quite a lot of his time doing. What the story is that Daniel escaped from the workhouse by climbing the fence in order to go on a drinking binge. Yet he could have just simply discharged himself with a few hours' notice, but Daniel obviously didn't fancy a night on the streets. Returning to the workhouse, Daniel was caught trying to climb back over the same fence, and he's actually found in this drunken state by William Oldys himself. And then comes the abusive language. And his punishment for this is 7 days hard labour in jail. But as a pauper, Daniel actually has nowhere else to go when he's freed from prison. So he actually has to go back to the workhouse. But this punishment seems to have really quite worked, because we don't hear any more about his drinking, and he appears to have become a reformed character. So I'm just going to finish now by saying that the workhouse was actually many things to many people. For some, it was essential in order just to survive. And the Victorian values of religion, self-worth, and the idea that you had to earn your poor relief actually does work for some. But these stories are actually rare. Most would become frequent visitors to the workhouse, or even become heavily dependent on the system. But the lives of the poor are often a forgotten part of our national history. Why focus on them rather than those Victorians who actually changed the national identity in some way? But the poor of Britain, who called the workhouse their home, all have fascinating stories to tell. They highlight exactly what happened in these institutions in ways that we're only beginning to scratch the surface of. Their histories are just as important, and we need to keep on telling them in order to give them a voice. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Nick. Can you hear me, Claire?
Yes, I can. Yeah.
Okay. Wow. That was really fascinating. Fascinating and insightful journey into the very personal, very sad, but very real lives of a few Chester workhouse inmates. Thank you, Nick. That was brilliant. I'm sure everybody really enjoyed that. So as I said right at the start, we've got some time now for anybody to ask any questions. We've got one or two questions that have come in through the chat within the past few minutes. But if anybody wants to speak to Nick, wants to direct any questions directly at Nick, if you can use the raise your hand function, then I'm sure Nick will do his best to clarify, inform, advise, whatever. I'm just looking at the chat now. Lots of thanks, obviously. Is there anything else, Nick, you want to say about the availability of the booklet and what future or further plans you've got?
Yeah, sure. So
okay.
The free book, the reason why I did a free booklet is because all of those slides, and trust me, there are lots more, and it just becomes too much in order to put on a PowerPoint and do a talk. So I've created a free booklet, and the website address, www.insidehistorymagazine.equid.com. If you go on there, and if you want to, you can download this free booklet, which will have even more of the newspaper reports and more of the censuses and much more of the things that I unfortunately couldn't put on absolutely everything. So please feel free, if you want to download that, to do exactly that. We also have issues of our magazine on there as well. Now, for the week of the Chester Heritage Festival, we decided that every single copy of the digital edition would be free of charge, so people can get a real sense of what we're all about. And we've got issues from the history of medicine, the history of crime, the history of protest. Trying to think of a few of the others, but they're all thematic. So please feel free to download them and check them out, and hopefully you enjoy them.
There's a question from Rachel Cross
Okay.
that's come up. Yeah.
Yeah, Rachel says, thank you. I'm currently reading The Five by Ellie Rubenhold, in which she describes in much detail conditions in London workhouses. They operated casual wards for overnight and day stays. Did Chester's workhouses also have this?
Yeah, Chester's would have had exactly the same thing. And that's mainly because in 1834, the new poor law actually kind of dictates absolutely everything. So whatever you see, I know Halley's book, it's absolutely fantastic, of the condition of the workhouses in 1888 would have been exactly the same as the ones undertaken by Chester at exactly the same time. It would have been different, though, before 1834. But that kind of nationalizes the whole workhouse system. So you can expect exactly the same treatment in Chester as what you would have done Whitechapel or other places in London. I hope I am.
Thanks, Nick.
That's okay.
I'm assuming, Rachel, are you happy with that?
If you haven't read Halley Rubenhold's The Five, I do really, really recommend it. It's an absolutely fascinating book which deals with the lives of 5 women who were victims of Jack the Ripper. Although it doesn't really deal with Jack the Ripper too much, if that's your thing, it mainly deals with the 5 victims and their entire life stories. And it's an absolutely brilliant book if you ever get the chance to read it. And a few... the reason why the workhouse is mentioned so much in that book is because a few of them have to stay there. It really is as simple as that. That is the harsh brutality of Victorian life for the poor or the casual poor. So if you do really want to find out more about that, I really recommend getting Halley's book.
There's a couple more questions.
Yep, got those. Nick, question from Joanne. Quick question, sounds daft. Do you know why the first workhouse decided to make jam, or was this used as a facade to hide the fact that it was a workhouse? I've not seen this before.
To answer your question, Joanne, the actual R.J. Davis and Co. For the jam and the marmalade and the sweets, it was actually after its time as a workhouse. So what happens is it is the workhouse until 1878, and then they all move over to Hoole. So we've now got a derelict building, and that is what R.J. Davis and Co. buy it, and then they convert it into their jam making factory. But the only reason why I've put that photo on, or that listen to me, that picture on, is because it's actually one of the only images we've actually got of how the workhouse would have looked. They wouldn't have changed too much when they were converting the building, mainly converting the outside, the inside, in order to make it a factory. But in terms of how the workhouse would have looked, it would have been exactly the same. The only difference is that now the poor have been moved out and they've been moved over to Hull, and R.J. Davis has taken over.
Thanks, Nick. Question from Barbara. The records you obtained, are they all from Chester Archives? Did you look at the National Archives at all?
Yeah, a little bit of both. Thank you for your question, Barbara. It's been difficult to get absolutely everything I want because there has been a pandemic going on, which has kind of been every single historian's worst nightmare when it comes to trying to get over down to the National Archives. The National Archives has actually only just reopened, I think, mid-May, with the announcement of the new unlocking. So a lot of the research, if you are interested in actually finding things like this out, in terms of your family history, a lot of the research comes from findmypast.com. And they have an excellent section, which is all about all forms of local government authorities, including the workhouse. And they use a lot of stuff from the National Archives and from the local archives as well. So if you are interested in finding out more, that's something I really do recommend. And that's also where I got a lot of the newspaper clippings from as well. So trying to research something like this during a pandemic was difficult, but thankfully the internet does come to your rescue. But all the records are completely legit.
Thanks, Nick. Questions keep coming in. Jackie. Nick, what do you know about Chester Working Boys Home, please? My grandfather grew up in the workhouse in Brighton. For some reason, he was then sent to the Chester Working Boys Home, which he left in 1904, aged 19 years. Isn't this rather old? Children started work at a much younger age.
Yeah, what actually happens is that we start getting more cottage homes. We got one in, I live in Upton, and we got one in Upton, which is quite close to the Spa on Long Lane. And it's now since been converted into offices and things like this. But there's quite a few of them around. And the reason why they do this is to try and get a lot of the children actually away from the workhouse. This comes a little bit later on. This is mainly an Edwardian thing. The vast majority of this talk has been Victorian. So I wouldn't be able to know too much about that based on this talk. But there are quite a few dotted around, and they were called cottage homes. And basically children would go and live there and be educated there, far away from the workhouse itself. But yeah, to try and answer your question, that's the best I can do, I'm afraid. I didn't really research too much into anything other than the two central workhouses during the Victorian period and the people who were on, who I've spoken about, I'm afraid.
Okay. Nick, question from Nicola. The story of the Worrells was very sad. Obviously, Emma was already 11 when she arrived with her mother, but were there any children born within workhouses? Obviously, men and women were segregated, but was assault common?
Yep, children were born in the workhouse. Quite a lot of them, actually. It would be a place where women, usually unmarried as well, would go. There was a huge stigma about being pregnant and single in the Victorian period. So a lot of children were actually born in the workhouse. Interestingly enough, it's only a little bit later on in the Edwardian period that the address actually changes. On the birth certificates, it would say the workhouse where they were born. But in the Edwardian period and post-Edwardian period, they actually start listing the street and the street number as their place of birth. So yeah, children were unfortunately born into the workhouse, and they would have been with their mother and looked after as well as they could. But as we've seen with this talk, even the healthcare was quite rudimentary. But yes, children were born in the workhouse. Yeah.
Okay, thanks, Nick. That's all the questions we've got currently from the chats. I can't see any hands raised anywhere, so unless we've got any other questions, I'll give it 10 seconds from anybody else. So we've got something. Comment from...
You can see me now.
Comment from Rachel, which I'm sure everyone can see on the chat. My mum always reminded me that I was born in the workhouse, much later anyway.
Oh, right.
When it was, of course, Chester City Hospital.
Yeah, it becomes Chester City Hospital from 1930 onwards. So even that, it's actually quite revolutionary, because the workhouse system actually goes on until 1948. And once the NHS is born, a lot of the old workhouses are converted into hospitals. But Chester's, around the Hoole area, actually becomes a hospital itself in 1930. So anyone born in the Hoole area from 1930 onwards was actually born in what used to be a workhouse. But also, I find it quite interesting because this is probably why some people of a certain age are so scared of hospitals, because they still see that workhouse element of it. My elderly neighbour was about 94 when he passed away, and he was terrified of going to the hospital. And I think it's that association with, this is where, you know, how they are and how they look, but also that's still association with that kind of workhouse thing. But thankfully here in Chester, we've got the Countess now, so we don't have to worry too much about that.
Great.
Can I ask a question? When you say the lunatic wing was closed,
Mm-hmm.
where did they go then? Was it the asylum in?
Well, no. At that particular moment, they would have been within the workhouse.
Right.
So all that would have actually happened was that they closed the lunatic wing, converted that into the infirmary, because they pretty much had to following the smallpox epidemic. Mm-hmm. And then they just allowed the inmates of the lunatic asylum part of the workhouse free reign with everyone else. It's only when the divas actually finally built that they start moving them over there.
Right. Thank you.
Anybody else? Any questions for Nick? Any final questions for Nick? Okay. Well, thanks everybody. Really appreciate your participation this evening, and thanks for joining us, Chester Heritage Festival. Please have a look at Nick's website, Inside History, and also have a look at www.chesterheritagefestival.co.uk. There's lots of other things happening over the course of this week through till next Monday, week-long festival. This is the first time we've kind of done this virtually, obviously because of the challenges we've faced through the pandemic, but the pandemic being quite devastating for everybody, it's given us an opportunity to build a platform to do things in a different way. And that gives us an opportunity for the future as well. So the festival will not be just a week-long festival. We'll continue to keep things live moving forward into 2022, when at some point in June we'll have another week and get back together for a whole host of other things, live and virtual, mixed together and blended as best we can. So we're kind of just giving it a different flavour this year. So big thanks, massive thanks to Nick. That was really superb. And thanks to everybody for joining us this evening. And take care, enjoy the rest of the week, participate where you can, and hopefully join us again at some point during the course of this week and beyond. Thanks very, very much, everybody, and good night.
Mm-hmm.